Danzig, September 1st, 1939, 4:45 in the morning. The German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opens fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte. The first shots of the Second World War have been fired. What follows over the next 6 years will kill somewhere between 70 and 85 million people, redraw every border on Earth, and determine which ideology controls the post-war world. It is the largest, most destructive event in human history, and it is taught in schools as though its outcome was inevitable. It was not. At least 10 times between 1939 and 1945, the war balanced on a single decision, a single weather report, a single spy's telegram, a single general's refusal to read a map. In each case, the difference between the world we got and a world under permanent Axis domination came down to something almost embarrassingly small. A halt order held for 72 hours. A bomb dropped on the wrong city by accident. A lighthouse keeper in Ireland who had no idea what his barometer readings were being used for. These are those 10 moments. Section 1. Hitler's halt order at Dunkirk. May 24th, 1940. May 24th, 1940. Northern France. The British Army is trapped. 3 weeks earlier, Germany had launched its invasion of France and the Low Countries. The attack came through the Ardennes forest, territory military planners had considered almost impassable for tanks. It worked. German armored columns punched through weak French defenses, swung northwest toward the English Channel, and cut off the entire British expeditionary force from the rest of the Allied armies in France. 500,000 men, British, French, and Belgian, were now squeezed into a shrinking pocket along the northern coast, their backs to the sea, the Germans closing from 3 sides. By May 23rd, General Heinz Guderian's 1st Panzer Division had already thrown pontoon bridges across the Aue Canal, the last significant water obstacle before Dunkirk. Standing on a hill, Guderian could see the town walls. His men were within 10 miles of the port. 1 British battalion stood in the road. At that moment, with the entire British Army a single armored push from destruction, the order arrived. Stop. The halt order came first from General Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group A, who issued it on the evening of May 23rd. Rundstedt's concern was straightforward. His panzer strength had taken serious losses during the rapid advance across France. Some units had lost 30 to 50% of their tanks. His flanks felt exposed. A British armored counterattack at Arras on May 21st had shaken German confidence, even though it ultimately failed. Rundstedt wanted the infantry to catch up before the tanks pushed further. Hitler visited Rundstedt's headquarters at Charleville on May 24th. He studied the map. He agreed with the halt. He extended it, confirmed it in writing, and had German High Command send the order to the front. The directive read, "By order of the Führer, the attack northwest of Arras is to be limited to the general line Lens-Bethune, Aire, Saint-Omer, Gravelines. The canal will not be crossed." Hermann Göring had also played his part. On May 23rd, the Luftwaffe chief had phoned Hitler personally and demanded that his air force be given the job of finishing off the Allied forces at Dunkirk. This was partly about prestige. Göring wanted the defining victory of the campaign to belong to the Luftwaffe, not the army. Hitler gave him room to operate. The panzers would hold. The planes would handle it. Guderian and other frontline commanders were furious. The outrage along the German lines was described as intense. Von Bock, commanding Army Group B to the east, was incensed. His infantry divisions were 50 miles from Dunkirk and would have to march through organized British resistance to get there. The armored divisions were right there, engines running, waiting for an order that would not come. The halt lasted 72 hours. On the afternoon of May 26th, Hitler ordered the panzers to resume their advance. But those 72 hours had changed everything. The British used the time. General Lord Gort, commanding the BEF, had already made the decision to pull back toward Dunkirk on May 23rd. The War Office in London formally ordered the evacuation on May 26th, the same day the halt was lifted. By then, the defensive perimeter around Dunkirk had been established and reinforced. When the German tanks finally began moving again, they faced a prepared defensive line rather than an open road. The evacuation, Operation Dynamo, ran from May 26th to June 4th. In 9 days, 338,226 British and French soldiers were lifted off the beaches by a combination of naval vessels and civilian craft. 198,000 were British. Around 1,000 British soldiers and 16,000 French soldiers died during the operation. The British left behind nearly all of their equipment: tanks, artillery, trucks, ammunition, but the men came home. The Luftwaffe, given its chance to finish the job, failed. Cloud cover limited flying conditions on several days. The RAF contested the airspace above Dunkirk. German bombing caused casualties among the troops on the beaches and sank ships, but it could not stop the evacuation. Historians have debated the halt order ever since. Some early accounts suggested Hitler deliberately allowed the British to escape, hoping to make peace easier. Serious historical analysis rejects this. The halt resulted from a combination of genuine military caution on Rundstedt's part, Hitler's own nervousness about the panzers being overextended, Göring's intervention, and a shared German underestimation of how quickly the British could organize a large-scale sea evacuation. As historians have noted, the British themselves did not believe more than a fraction of the BEF could be saved. Why would the Germans have assumed differently? What is not in dispute is the consequence. Guderian called it one of the decisions with the most disastrous influence on the whole future course of the war. Winston Churchill, who had become Prime Minister only on May 10th, presented the evacuation to the British public as a miracle and a sign of national resilience. He was careful to note it was not a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations. But the survival of the BEF gave Britain a trained army when it had almost lost one entirely. Without those 338,000 men, Britain's ability to continue the war was genuinely in question. Churchill's political position inside his own government was fragile. Members of the War Cabinet, including Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax, were already discussing whether a negotiated peace with Germany might be unavoidable. The return of the army did not end that argument immediately, but it changed the terms of it. The panzers sat idle for 72 hours. The British walked into the sea and came home. But Dunkirk was only the first moment the war's outcome hung on a single decision. A few months later, over the skies of England, Germany would again be on the edge of a victory it could not quite reach. And this time, the mistake would be even harder to explain. Section 2. The Luftwaffe switches from airfields to London. September 7, 1940. By the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone. France had fallen. The Low Countries were occupied. The Soviet Union was still bound to Germany by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The United States was neutral. If Germany could knock Britain out of the war, Hitler would control the entire European continent with no serious enemy left on his western flank. The plan for invasion, Operation Sea Lion, was already drafted. But an amphibious assault across the English Channel required one thing first: air superiority. The Luftwaffe had to destroy the Royal Air Force. That is what Hermann Göring set out to do from August 13, 1940, onward. The German strategy in this phase was methodical. The Luftwaffe targeted RAF Fighter Command's airfields in southern England, its radar stations along the coast, and the factories producing replacement aircraft. The Chain Home Radar Network, the world's first integrated early warning system capable of detecting incoming aircraft from up to 80 miles away, was a particular priority. If the Germans could blind Fighter Command and crater its airfields faster than the RAF could repair them, the battle was effectively won. For several weeks in late August, it was working. At the height of the Battle of Britain, RAF Fighter Command had only 749 serviceable fighters against a Luftwaffe force of approximately 2,550 aircraft. By mid-August, the shortage of trained pilots had become acute. Aircraft production was keeping pace. Britain was actually outproducing Germany in fighters during this period, with over 4,200 fighters built in 1940. But experienced pilots were harder to replace than machines. Men were being sent into combat after only a few hours of flying time in their aircraft. The average age of an RAF fighter pilot was 20. Those killed averaged 22. By late August, the pressure on the airfield infrastructure was severe. Sector stations, the nerve centers that directed fighters to intercept incoming raids, were taking repeated hits. If those stations went down in enough numbers, Fighter Command's ability to coordinate its defense would collapse. Ground crews were being killed. Runways were cratered. The system was under strain it could not sustain indefinitely. Then, on the night of August 24th, a group of German bombers went off course and dropped bombs on civilian areas of London. It was an accident. The Luftwaffe had standing orders not to bomb London without Hitler's specific authorization. The crews were aiming for oil storage facilities and other military targets. Bad navigation in the dark brought their bombs down on residential streets instead. Churchill ordered retaliation the next night. RAF Bomber Command struck Berlin. The damage to Berlin was minimal. The psychological impact on Hitler was not. He had told the German public that enemy bombs would never fall on the Reich capital. Now they had. In a speech on September 4th, he announced that Germany would rub out British cities. On September 6th, he and Goering formally ordered the switch. The Luftwaffe would stop targeting Fighter Command's infrastructure and shift to bombing London. The Blitz began on September 7, 1940. That afternoon, 300 German bombers, escorted by 600 fighters, crossed the Channel and struck London's East End. The docks burned. 430 civilians were killed and 1,600 injured on the first night alone. London was then bombed for 57 consecutive nights. The raids were enormous, sustained, and devastating to the civilian population. But they were hitting London, not RAF airfields. The immediate effect on Fighter Command was relief. The sector stations stopped being bombed. Runways were repaired. Ground crews could work without being killed. Pilots who were already exhausted got marginally more time between scrambles. The system that had been cracking under sustained pressure was given weeks to partially reconstitute. On September 15th, now marked as Battle of Britain Day, the Luftwaffe launched two massive waves against London. RAF Fighter Command met them with everything it had. The Germans lost 56 aircraft that day. British losses were 26 fighters. It was not the most costly day of the battle in terms of German losses, but the scale of the defeat convinced the German High Command that air superiority over Britain was not achievable on the current trajectory. 2 days later, on September 17th, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The invasion was off. The switch from airfields to cities had handed the RAF exactly what it needed at exactly the moment it was most vulnerable. Goering genuinely believed bombing London would finish the job. His logic was not irrational on its face. Destroy civilian morale, force the British government to negotiate. But pre-war British studies had examined the scenario and projected 58,000 Londoners dead in the first 24 hours of serious bombing. Those projections proved wildly wrong. The actual death toll across the entire 8-month Blitz was approximately 43,500 civilians across all of Britain. Terrible, but nothing close to the collapse of public order that planners had feared. Londoners went underground, kept working, and kept fighting. The question of what would have happened if the Luftwaffe had continued targeting Fighter Command instead of switching to London is one historians have debated since 1940. The honest answer is that no one can know for certain. What the evidence shows is that the RAF was under severe and escalating pressure in late August. The sector station system was degrading. Pilot reserves were thin. The switch gave Fighter Command time it would not otherwise have had. An accidental bombing, a retaliatory raid on Berlin, a furious dictator making a decision based on wounded pride rather than military logic. These were the things that kept Britain in the war. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The survival of Britain as a base of operations mattered enormously for what came next. Without it, there was no platform for the American buildup that would eventually come. Without it, there was no second front in Western Europe. But Britain staying in the war was only part of what Germany needed to worry about. Because in the spring of 1941, Hitler was about to make a decision in the Balkans that would cost him something he could never get back: time. Section 3. Mussolini's Greek disaster. Delays Barbarossa. April to June 1941. On October 28, 1940, Mussolini invaded Greece. He did not tell Hitler first. This was not a minor diplomatic discourtesy. It was the beginning of a chain of events that would delay Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union by roughly 6 weeks. And those 6 weeks would place German soldiers at the gates of Moscow just as the Russian winter arrived. Mussolini had watched Hitler conquer Poland, Denmark, Norway, France, and the Low Countries in rapid succession. He wanted a parallel victory of his own, something to demonstrate that Italy was an equal partner in the Axis rather than a spectator. Greece seemed achievable. He committed 162,000 Italian troops to the invasion from Albania, which Italy already controlled. His generals told him Greece would fall within 2 weeks. It did not fall within 2 weeks. The Greek army fought back with unexpected. Within days, Greek divisions were pushing the Italian lines back into Albania. By mid-November, the Italians had lost the initiative entirely. Greek forces were advancing into Albanian territory that Italy had controlled for years. Mussolini's quick victory had become a grinding stalemate that was embarrassing the entire Axis alliance publicly and straining Italian resources severely. Hitler was furious. He had not been consulted, he had not planned for this, and now the southeastern flank of Europe, an area he needed stable for his upcoming invasion of the Soviet Union, was a mess created entirely by his allies' incompetence. Then it got worse. Yugoslavia had been pressured into the Axis alliance and signed the Tripartite Pact on March 25, 1941. 2 days later, a group of Yugoslav military officers staged a coup in Belgrade, overturned the government, and repudiated the agreement. Yugoslavia was now hostile. Hitler called an emergency conference with his senior military leaders and Foreign Minister Ribbentrop. The meeting was so hastily arranged that some attendees arrived late. Hitler was described as shouting that he had been personally insulted. He demanded Yugoslavia be destroyed with unmerciful harshness in blitzkrieg style. He also announced that the invasion of the Soviet Union would have to be postponed. His exact words, recorded in the top secret notes of that meeting and underlined by the note-taker: "The beginning of the Barbarossa operation will have to be postponed up to 4 weeks. Operation Marita, the invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece, launched on April 6, 1941. Yugoslavia collapsed in 11 days. Greece fell by late April. Britain, which had sent forces to support Greece, was driven out. The island of Crete fell after a costly German airborne assault in late May, though the assault was so expensive and elite parachute troops that Hitler never authorized a major airborne operation again for the rest of the war. The original planned date for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was May 15, 1941. The actual date was June 22nd, 38 days later. The reasons for the delay were not only the Balkan campaign. Historians have noted that an unusually wet winter kept rivers in eastern Poland and western Russia at full flood until late spring, making large-scale armored movement difficult before mid-May regardless. Romania and Finland, who were to participate in the invasion, also needed additional preparation time. These factors would have pushed the start date somewhat later than May 15th, even without the Yugoslav crisis. But the Balkan campaign added specific, documented damage beyond the calendar delay. Ewald von Kleist, who commanded a panzer army in Barbarossa, stated after the war that the bulk of the tanks assigned to his command for the Soviet campaign had taken part in the Balkan offensive and needed overhaul, while their crews needed rest. The crack panzer and motorized divisions that formed the cutting edge of the German attack, not the slow-moving infantry, but the fast armored units that the entire blitzkrieg concept depended on, had been fighting in difficult Balkan terrain and were not at full readiness when Barbarossa began. The loss of elite troops mattered too. The paratroopers decimated at Crete were unavailable for operations in the Soviet Union. The Luftwaffe transport aircraft lost over Crete reduced German airborne capacity significantly, and an estimated 300,000 armed Yugoslav soldiers had simply disappeared into the mountains rather than formally surrendering, forcing Germany to garrison the Balkans with divisions that would otherwise have been available for the Eastern Front. That garrison requirement grew as partisan resistance intensified throughout the war. The 38-day delay placed the German advance on Moscow in October 1941, rather than August or September. Army Group Center captured Smolensk in late July and was within striking distance of Moscow when Hitler made his August decision to divert forces south toward Kiev. When the Moscow offensive finally resumed at the end of September, German soldiers were advancing into the autumn rains, the Rasputitsa, the season of mud that made Russian roads nearly impassable. Then came the snow. Then came temperatures that dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. German officers could see the Kremlin buildings through their field glasses in early December. The advance stalled 5 miles from Moscow's outskirts on December 2nd. On December 5th, the Soviets launched their counteroffensive. Hitler himself understood what Mussolini's misadventure had cost him. He reportedly said that if the Italians had not attacked Greece and forced German intervention, the war would have taken a different course. That Germany could have anticipated the Russian cold by weeks and conquered Leningrad and Moscow, and that there would have been no Stalingrad. Whether those 6 weeks would truly have been enough to take Moscow is debated by historians. What is not debated is that Germany arrived at the decisive moment of the Eastern Campaign with damaged equipment, depleted elite forces, and a calendar that was already running out. Mussolini wanted a quick war. He got a slow defeat, and dragged the entire German war effort into the mud with him. The time lost in the Balkans shaped what happened next on the Eastern Front. But even with Barbarossa starting on schedule, the decisions Hitler made once inside Soviet territory would have had to be different too. Because in August 1941, with Moscow within reach, he was about to turn his best tanks in the wrong direction entirely. Section 4. Hitler turned south to Kiev, instead of Moscow, August 21st, 1941. By mid-July 1941, the German army was 200 miles from Moscow. Barbarossa had launched on June 22nd with over 3.8 million Axis troops crossing into the Soviet Union along an 1,800-mile front. The results in the first weeks were staggering. On the first day alone, 1,800 Soviet aircraft were destroyed, most of them on the ground. Army Group Center, the strongest of the 3 attacking groups, had captured Smolensk by late July. The road to Moscow was open. German generals looking at the map believed they were weeks away from ending the war in the east. Then Hitler stopped them. The disagreement that erupted in the German High Command in August 1941 was one of the most consequential internal arguments of the entire war. General Franz Halder, the Army Chief of Staff and principal architect of Barbarossa, had designed the campaign around Moscow as the decisive objective. His reasoning was straightforward. Moscow was the Soviet Union's largest city, its communications hub, its rail center, and its political capital. The Soviet leadership would be forced to defend it with everything they had. The Wehrmacht could destroy those defending forces in a single, decisive battle and end Soviet resistance. Hitler disagreed. He believed the war could not be won by capturing cities. It would be won by destroying the Soviet economy, and that meant Ukraine. The grain fields, the coal of the Donets Basin, the industrial capacity of the region. These were what Germany needed, and what the Soviet Union could not function without. Leningrad in the north and Ukraine in the south were his priorities. Moscow could wait. The two positions were incompatible, and through July and into August, the argument ground on. Halder and Field Marshal von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, pushed for Moscow. Hitler pushed back. He interpreted their intelligence reports about Soviet forces concentrating near Moscow, not as an argument for attacking there, but as evidence that staying in the center was exactly the wrong move. The flanks needed clearing first. On August 21st, Hitler issued a formal directive. Army Group Center's panzers, specifically Guderian's Panzer Group 2, which had been the cutting edge of the advance, were ordered south. Their target was Ukraine and the encirclement of Soviet forces around Kiev. The reaction from the senior German officers was described by those present as stunned. When Halder announced the decision to his colleagues, Field Marshal von Bock asked what they could do against it. Halder replied, "Nothing. It is immutable." Halder arranged one last attempt to change Hitler's mind. He sent Guderian to meet the Führer personally on August 23rd at the Wolfslayer headquarters in East Prussia. Guderian went into the meeting intending to argue for Moscow. He laid out the case. Moscow was the head and heart of the Soviet Union. It was where the Red Army would make its stand. It was where Germany could deliver the killing blow. Hitler listened, walked to the map, put his hand on Ukraine, and delivered a lecture on economic warfare. Guderian came out of the meeting having agreed to lead the southern operation himself. Halder, believing Guderian had simply accommodated Hitler to preserve his command, was furious. He asked Field Marshal von Brauchitsch to resign with him in joint protest. Brauchitsch declined. Guderian's Panzer Group 2 turned south on August 25th. The Kiev encirclement was completed on September 19th. Kleist's panzers from Army Group South linked up with Guderian's from the north near Lokvitsa on September 16th, closing the trap. Inside it were 4 Soviet armies. When the fighting in the pocket ended on September 25th, approximately 665,000 Soviet soldiers had been captured. It was the single largest encirclement in military history. The commander of the Soviet Southwestern Front, Colonel General Kirponos, was killed. By any tactical measure, it was a spectacular German victory. But the calendar had kept moving. Operation Typhoon, the German drive on Moscow, did not begin until September 30th, more than 6 weeks after the panzers had turned south. The opening phases went well. German forces broke through Soviet defensive lines at Vyazma and Bryansk, capturing another 600,000 soldiers. But Army Group Center was advancing into October, and October in Russia brings the Rasputitsa, the autumn rains that turn unpaved roads into rivers of mud. German vehicles sank, supply columns ground to a halt. The advance slowed to a crawl. Then the mud froze. The temperature dropped to -20, then -30, then -40 degrees Celsius. German soldiers had been issued summer uniforms. Hitler had promised a campaign over before winter. The army had not been equipped for what they were now living through. Tanks and trucks froze. Motor oil turned to the consistency of caramel. Frostbite casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands. The advance on Moscow resumed with the freeze in November, because at least the frozen ground could support vehicles. German spearheads got within 5 miles of the city. Officers reported seeing the sun reflecting off the Kremlin's onion domes through their field glasses. On December 2nd, a reconnaissance unit reached a point 5 miles from Moscow's outskirts. That was the limit of the entire offensive. On December 5th, the Soviets launched their counterattack with fresh divisions transferred from Siberia, troops equipped for winter warfare, rested and ready. The Germans were pushed back from Moscow's approaches. Several German formations were encircled in their turn. Hitler relieved Guderian of command in December for recommending withdrawal. He relieved numerous other senior commanders too. The army that had stood 200 miles from Moscow in mid-July never got there. Whether Moscow's capture would have ended the war is genuinely debated. The Soviet government had already partially evacuated eastward, but the logistical and psychological blow of losing the capital and the rail network centered on it would have been severe. The opportunity existed in July. By December, it was gone. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The decision to turn south had taken 6 weeks and produced the largest prisoner haul in history. It had also taken 6 weeks that Germany could not afford to spend anywhere but Moscow. And while Hitler was making that call, a decision was quietly being made on the other side of the world that would determine whether the Soviet Union survived at all. Not on a battlefield, but in a conference room in Tokyo. Section 5. Japan chooses South Pacific over Siberia, September 1941. In the summer of 1941, Stalin was fighting for his life on one front. The question that would determine whether the Soviet Union survived was whether he would soon be fighting on two. Germany had been pressuring Japan since the launch of Barbarossa on June 22nd to open a second front against the Soviet Union from the east. The logic was simple. If Japan attacked Siberia while Germany attacked from the west, the Soviet Union would be crushed between them. The Red Army would be forced to split its already strained forces across two fronts separated by thousands of miles. There were no reserves large enough to handle that. The Soviet state, in all likelihood, would not survive it. Japan had the forces to do it. The Kwantung Army stationed in Manchuria was one of Japan's largest and most battle-hardened commands, positioned directly on the Soviet border. Germany pushed hard through diplomatic channels for Japan to act. Japanese Foreign Minister Matsuoka had personally visited Berlin and Moscow earlier in 1941 and had signed a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union on April 13th. But pacts in wartime are political instruments, not permanent commitments. The question was whether Japan's leadership would tear it up and go north. Inside Japan, the debate was real and serious. Imperial conferences in July and August 1941 weighed the options. Going north meant attacking the Soviet Union while it was already engaged with Germany, potentially a quick, decisive campaign against a weakened enemy. Going south meant seizing the oil fields, rubber, and raw materials of the British, Dutch, and French colonial territories in Southeast Asia, resources Japan desperately needed to sustain its war in China and fuel its navy. The southern option meant almost certain conflict with Britain and the United States. The Japanese army favored north. The navy favored south. The navy won. On September 6, 1941, an imperial conference formally confirmed that Japan would pursue the southern expansion and prepare for potential war with the United States and Britain. The decision was not announced publicly. It was made at the highest levels of the Japanese government and military establishment, inside closed sessions that few people outside the room knew had even taken place. One of those few was Richard Sorge. Sorge was a German journalist based in Tokyo. He was also a Soviet military intelligence officer, one of the most effective spies in the history of the Second World War. Operating undercover since 1933, he had embedded himself at the center of Tokyo's German expatriate community and cultivated close relationships with Japanese government officials and military figures. His primary contact inside the Japanese establishment was Hotsumi Ozaki, a journalist and government advisor with access to the highest levels of Japanese policy deliberation. Through Ozaki, Sorge tracked the internal Japanese debate through the summer of 1941. As the imperial conferences reached their conclusion, Ozaki reported back what he was hearing. The German ambassador in Tokyo, Eugen Ott, a close personal friend of Sorge's, separately confirmed to Sorge the total failure of his own efforts to persuade the Japanese to attack Russia. The picture was clear. On September 14, 1941, Sorge transmitted his most important dispatch of the entire war to Moscow. "In the careful judgment of all of us here," he wrote, "the possibility of Japan launching an attack, which existed until recently, has disappeared. The telegram reached Moscow and was circulated at the highest levels of the Soviet government. The version in the military archives bears Stalin's initials alongside those of Molotov, Beria, and Marshal Voroshilov. Stalin had seen it. He understood what it meant. It meant he could move his Siberian divisions west. In the 2 months that followed, 15 infantry divisions, 3 cavalry divisions, 1,700 tanks, and 1,500 aircraft transferred from the Soviet Far East to the European front. These were not ordinary units. The Siberian divisions were fully equipped for extreme winter warfare. Their soldiers wore proper winter clothing, used lubricants that worked in deep cold, and had trained in conditions that were destroying the German army advancing on Moscow. They arrived at the front in late November and early December 1941, precisely when the German offensive was stalling at Moscow's outskirts. On December 5, 1941, 2 days before Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the Soviets launched their counteroffensive outside Moscow. The Siberian divisions were at its core. The German advance was stopped and pushed back. Moscow did not fall. Sorge did not live to be recognized for what he had done. Japanese police had been tracking the source of coded radio transmissions being sent from somewhere in Tokyo for months. In October 1941, just weeks after his critical September dispatch, they traced the signal. Sorge and his network were arrested. He was tortured, tried, and hanged on November 7, 1944. Stalin declined to intervene on his behalf with the Japanese, and for years the Soviet government officially denied that Sorge had been a Soviet agent. He was posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union in 1964, 20 years after his execution. The stakes of what Japan decided in September 1941 were enormous. A Japanese attack on Siberia would have meant those 15 infantry divisions, those 1,700 tanks, those winter-equipped soldiers never reached Moscow. The German army, which got within 5 miles of the Kremlin, would have faced a defense stripped of its strongest available reserves. The city that the entire Soviet rail and communications network ran through might have fallen. Instead, Japan went south. The Siberian troops went west. Moscow held. One decision made in closed session by Japanese admirals and generals, a decision about oil fields and colonial territories thousands of miles from Russia, may have saved the Soviet Union from collapse in the winter of 1941. The Soviets survived that winter because of what Japan chose not to do. But survival is not victory. To actually win the war, the Allies needed to be able to read their enemies, literally. And in the Pacific, in the spring of 1942, a group of codebreakers working in a basement in Pearl Harbor were about to hand the United States the most important intelligence victory of the entire war. Section 6. The Code-Breaking Victory at Midway, June 4th to 7th, 1942. In the spring of 1942, Japan had not lost a single major engagement in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor had crippled the American battleship fleet. Wake Island had fallen. The Philippines had fallen. Singapore, Britain's supposedly impregnable fortress in Southeast Asia, had surrendered in February 1942 with 80,000 troops, the largest British capitulation in history. Japanese forces were advancing through Burma, threatening India. In the space of 5 months, Japan had seized a vast arc of territory across the Pacific and Southeast Asia that its planners had expected would take far longer to conquer. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had designed the Pearl Harbor attack, understood something his colleagues did not fully appreciate. This could not last. He had lived in the United States, studied at Harvard, traveled widely through the country. He knew its industrial capacity in a way most Japanese commanders did not. Before the war, he had warned that he could run wild for a year, but that he had no confidence for the second or third year. His goal was to force the United States to negotiate a peace settlement before American industry could convert fully to war production and flood the Pacific with ships, aircraft, and men Japan could not match. To do that, he needed to destroy what remained of the American carrier fleet. The carriers had been at sea during Pearl Harbor and survived. His plan was to seize Midway Atoll, a small but strategically significant island at the western edge of the Hawaiian archipelago, and use it as bait. The Americans would have to defend it. When their carriers came out to fight, the Imperial Japanese Navy would be waiting with overwhelming force and sink them. With the American carrier fleet gone, Japan could dictate terms. The plan was meticulous, carefully timed, and completely compromised before it began. In the basement of a Pearl Harbor administrative building, Commander Joseph Rochefort led the U.S. Navy's Combat Intelligence Unit, known as Station Hypo. Rochefort's team had been breaking portions of Japan's primary naval code, designated JN-25B, since early 1942. By April, they had gotten good enough at it that they could intercept, decrypt, and partially translate Japanese radio messages within hours of transmission. The messages they were reading through May pointed clearly toward a major Japanese operation in the Pacific, targeting a location the Japanese code designated simply as AF. The problem was confirmation. Rochefort and his team were convinced AF meant Midway. Washington's Naval Intelligence Office, OP-20G, disagreed. They thought the Japanese might be targeting the South Pacific, or Hawaii, or even the American West Coast. Without confirmation, Admiral Nimitz could not risk his 3 remaining carriers on Rochefort's analysis alone. Rochefort devised a ruse that was simple enough to fit on a single page. Midway Island was connected to Pearl Harbor by a secure undersea cable that Japanese signals could not intercept. Rochefort sent orders to Midway through the cable, instructing the base to broadcast an uncoded radio message, deliberately unencrypted so Japanese listening stations would pick it up, stating that the island's water desalination plant had broken down and Midway was running short of fresh water. Within 24 hours, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese naval message reporting that AF was short of water. AF was Midway. The confirmation was absolute. Rochefort's team then cracked the date encryption in the JN-25B code and determined the attack would come in late May to early June 1942. They identified the Japanese order of battle, 4 fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, and established the approximate timing of the assault. Nimitz moved. The USS Yorktown, which had been severely damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea and was estimated to require months of repair, was patched up in the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard in just 48 hours. All 3 American carriers, Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, were positioned at a point northeast of Midway that Nimitz designated Point Luck, where they could wait in ambush. The Japanese had no idea the Americans knew they were coming. On the morning of June 4th, Japanese aircraft from the 4 carriers attacked and bombed the Midway base. As the Japanese planes returned to their carriers to rearm and refuel for a second strike, Admiral Nagumo received word that American naval forces were in the area. The news created confusion aboard the Japanese carriers. Aircraft were being rearmed for a second land attack on Midway. Now Nagumo needed them armed for anti-ship warfare instead. The flight decks were crowded with planes, fuel lines, and munitions when the American dive bombers arrived. At 10:20 in the morning, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led his dauntless dive bombers from the USS Enterprise down through the thin cloud cover and into the Japanese carrier formation. In the space of approximately 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were set ablaze and fatally damaged. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, survived long enough to launch 2 strikes that severely damaged the Yorktown before American dive bombers found and destroyed her that afternoon. Japan lost all 4 carriers. It lost approximately 3,057 men. It lost somewhere between 228 and 248 aircraft. More painful than any of those numbers was the loss of hundreds of experienced naval aviators, men who had trained for years and could not be quickly replaced. The United States lost the Yorktown, 1 destroyer, 144 aircraft, and 362 men. General George Marshall later summarized what the code breaking had meant in direct terms. As a result of cryptanalysis, he said, the Americans were able to concentrate their limited forces to meet the Japanese advance on Midway, when they otherwise would have been 3,000 miles out of place. After June 4th, Japan initiated no new major offensive operations in the Pacific. the initiative had shifted permanently. A month later, the Americans launched their first offensive of the Pacific War at Guadalcanal. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The code breaking that won Midway depended entirely on intelligence reaching the right people and being acted upon in time. But as the Allies would discover repeatedly, intelligence is only as useful as the commanders willing to listen to it. And in September 1944, one of the most consequential intelligence failures of the entire war would happen not because the information was missing, but because the man in charge refused to believe it. Section 7. The D-Day Weather Window, June 4th to 6th, 1944. Planning for the invasion of Normandy had been underway for years. By the spring of 1944, southern England was packed with men, vehicles, ships, and ammunition on a scale that had no historical precedent. Over 156,000 troops would cross the Channel on the first day alone. Nearly 7,000 naval vessels were involved. Thousands of aircraft were committed to supporting the landings. The logistics of assembling this force had taken the combined industrial output of Britain, the United States, and Canada working at full capacity for the better part of 2 years. All of it depended on the weather. The requirements were specific and unforgiving. The invasion needed a full moon for the airborne troops dropping behind enemy lines the night before. They needed to see the ground. It needed a low tide at dawn, so the first waves of landing craft could see, avoid, and disarm the obstacles and mines the Germans had planted on the beaches. It needed acceptable wind and sea conditions, so the landing craft could actually reach the shore without capsizing. It needed enough cloud clearance for the Allied air forces to operate and protect the landings from German armor and infantry moving up to counterattack. In June 1944, all those conditions coincided on exactly 3 days, June 5th, 6th, and 7th. If the invasion missed those 3 days, the next suitable window was 2 weeks away. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, set June 5th as the date. The weather team assembled to advise him was led by Group Captain James Stagg of the RAF, a meteorologist described by those who worked with him as a dour but canny Scot. Stagg coordinated 3 separate teams of forecasters, British and American, who used different methods and frequently disagreed. The American team used an analog approach, comparing current conditions to historical weather patterns for the same dates. The British teams analyzed live measurements of temperature, pressure, and humidity to map weather fronts as they developed. On the morning of June 3rd, weather observations from Blacksod Lighthouse in County Mayo on the northwest coast of Ireland, transmitted under a secret 1939 agreement between the Irish government and the British Met Office, reported rapidly falling barometric pressure. A major storm system was approaching. The lighthouse keeper, Ted Sweeney, had no idea his readings were being used to plan the largest amphibious operation in history. By June 4th, the storm had arrived. Strong winds, heavy rain, low cloud cover, rough seas. The conditions over Normandy were exactly what the invasion could not tolerate. The American forecasters had predicted the weather would be acceptable. The British teams had predicted the storm. Stagg sided with the British assessment. At 4:15 in the morning on June 4th, in a room at Southwick House near Portsmouth, with the trees outside bending in the wind and rain lashing the windows, Stagg told Eisenhower the weather was too dangerous to proceed. Eisenhower postponed. The invasion was delayed 24 hours. Some of the convoys already at sea had to be recalled. One convoy, Convoy U2A, carrying part of the 4th Infantry Division toward Utah Beach, did not receive the recall signal and had to be located by a Walrus reconnaissance aircraft that searched all day before finding it 30 miles south of the Isle of Wight, already 36 miles into its journey toward France, before turning it back. That afternoon, as the storm battered the channel, Stagg's team received a report from a single weather ship stationed 600 miles west of Ireland. Its barometer was rising. Stagg studied the data. He concluded that a brief ridge of high pressure would build behind the storm, opening a narrow window of calmer weather on June 6th before the next system arrived. The window would not be perfect. Winds and seas would still be above ideal, but it would be usable. On the evening of June 4th, Stagg presented this forecast to Eisenhower and the assembled commanders. The weather outside was still terrible. Eisenhower reportedly sat silently for several minutes, then said, "Okay, let her rip." The invasion would go on June 6th. On the other side of the channel, German meteorologists had reached their own conclusion about the weather. The Luftwaffe's chief forecaster predicted that gale-force winds and rough seas would persist until mid-June. German commanders were so confident no invasion was imminent that many had left their coastal positions. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, in command of German defenses along the Atlantic Wall, had returned to Germany to present his wife with a pair of shoes for her birthday on June 6th. The German Weather Service had far fewer observation stations than the Allies. Crucially, they had none in the North Atlantic, the area where Stagg's critical data about the pressure ridge had come from. They could not see the brief window opening behind the storm because they had no way to observe it. The Allied landings on June 6th faced difficult conditions. Rough seas caused landing craft to capsize. Paratroopers dropped in the wrong locations because of cloud cover and navigation errors. The beach obstacles were harder to clear because the tide came in faster than anticipated. Casualties on Omaha Beach alone were catastrophic, but the Germans were caught completely off guard. Weeks later, Stagg sent Eisenhower a memorandum noting that had the invasion been delayed to the next suitable tidal window, the troops would have encountered the worst channel weather in 20 years. The storm of June 19th destroyed one of the two Mulberry artificial harbors the Allies had constructed off the Normandy coast, and temporarily halted the buildup of men and supplies. Had the invasion fleet been at sea or on the beaches during that storm, the consequences would have been catastrophic. Eisenhower wrote on the memorandum, "I thank the gods of war we went when we did." The weather window that made D-Day possible was identified from a single ship's barometer reading and a lighthouse keeper who never knew what his job actually was. That sliver of good weather opened just wide enough, just long enough, for the largest seaborne invasion in history to get its foothold in France. The Normandy landings worked because of intelligence, timing, and a narrow gap in the clouds. But while the Allies were fighting their way off the beaches and into France that summer, Hitler made a decision back in Berlin that handed his enemies something no military operation could have delivered. He personally dragged the world's largest economy into the war against him, and he did it entirely by choice. Section 8. Hitler declares war on the United States. December 11th, 1941. On December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Hitler found out the same way most of the world did, from news reports. Japan had given Germany no advance warning. The attack was planned and executed entirely without consulting Berlin. Hitler was at his Eastern Front headquarters, the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, absorbing the reality that his Russian campaign had permanently stalled within sight of Moscow, that his army was freezing to death in temperatures below -30 degrees Celsius, and that the Soviet counteroffensive launched 2 days earlier was pushing his forces back from the city he had promised to capture before winter. Then came the news from Hawaii. 4 days later, on December 11th, 1941, Hitler stood before the Reichstag in Berlin and declared war on the United States. He was under no obligation to do so. This point is worth sitting with for a moment because it is frequently misunderstood. The Tripartite Pact, signed by Germany, Japan, and Italy in September 1940, committed each party to come to the other's defense if attacked by a third power. Japan had not been attacked. Japan had attacked. The Pact's Mutual Defense Clause did not apply. A formal treaty specifically obligating Germany to declare war alongside Japan if Japan initiated hostilities had been drafted and circulated in the weeks before Pearl Harbor, but it remained unsigned on December 7th. Germany had no legal or treaty commitment to enter the war against the United States. Roosevelt understood this. He had asked Congress on December 8th for a declaration of war against Japan only. He made no mention of Germany. The Senate approved it 82-0. The House voted 388-1. Roosevelt had been maneuvering for months to find a way to bring America fully into the European war, but domestic isolationist sentiment was powerful enough that he could not simply demand it. A Gallup poll taken on December 10th after Pearl Harbor, but before the German declaration, found that 90% of Americans answered yes when asked whether Roosevelt should ask Congress to declare war on Germany as well. But Roosevelt had not asked. He was waiting. Hitler asked for him. The decision was made after 2 days of consultation with Goering, Keitel, Raeder, and Ribbentrop. All of them advised declaring war, primarily because it would free the Kriegsmarine to begin unrestricted submarine warfare against American shipping in the Atlantic, what German submariners called the Second Happy Time. Hitler needed little persuading. In his Reichstag speech, he accused Roosevelt of engineering the war through a series of deliberate provocations, of being controlled by Jewish financial interests, and of using the New Deal's failures as a reason to start a foreign conflict. The Reichstag responded with thunderous applause. When German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop read the declaration to the American chargé d'affaires Leland Morris at the German Foreign Ministry, he reportedly screamed at Morris that Roosevelt had wanted this war and now he had it, then turned on his heel and left the room. What drove Hitler to make the decision is not a simple question. He had believed for years that war with the United States was eventually inevitable, that Roosevelt's material support for Britain and the Soviet Union already constituted an undeclared war. His army adjutant Gerhard Engel recorded in his diary in December 1940 that Hitler did not believe the USA would enter the war. By 1941, that assessment had shifted. Hitler became convinced Roosevelt was going to declare war on Germany, regardless of what Germany did, and that it was better to choose the moment himself than to have it chosen for him. He also profoundly underestimated the United States. His worldview categorized America as a racially mongrel, politically corrupt, Jewish-dominated nation that lacked the national character to fight a serious war. Albert Speer, his own armaments minister, later said that Hitler actually knew nothing about his enemies and refused to use the information available to him. In September 1940, Hitler had told his generals that American rearmament would not reach its peak before 1945. Even if that estimate was correct, declaring war in December 1941 handed the United States the political permission to direct the full weight of that rearmament directly at Germany 4 years early. The practical consequences were immediate and enormous. The Germany that declared war on December 11th was already fighting the Soviet Union across an 1,800-mile front, sustaining 750,000 casualties in 6 months, running short of winter equipment, and watching its Moscow offensive collapse. It was fighting Britain in North Africa. Its submarines were engaged across the Atlantic. It now added to these commitments a formal state of war with the country that had the largest economy on Earth, which had spent 2 years expanding its industrial capacity and had barely begun to put that capacity into military production. Historians Brendan Sims and Charles Laderman have argued that December 11th was more consequential than December 7th, that it was Hitler's declaration of war, not Pearl Harbor, that created the global strategic reality that ultimately destroyed the Third Reich. Without the German declaration, Roosevelt faced genuine domestic political constraints on entering the European war. The isolationist argument that America's war was in the Pacific against Japan, not in Europe against Germany, would have had real traction. Hitler eliminated that argument in a single speech. He also ensured that the Europe First strategy, the Allied decision to prioritize Germany's defeat before Japan's, became American policy. America's industrial output, its manpower, its strategic bombers, its armies, all of it now pointed at Germany. Churchill, upon hearing the news, later wrote that he went to bed that night and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. He understood immediately what Hitler had done. The man who declared war on the United States did so while his army was freezing outside Moscow, while his air force had failed to knock Britain out of the war, and while the Soviet Union had just demonstrated it was not going to collapse on schedule. Adding the world's largest economy to the list of active enemies in that moment was not strategy. It was a gamble built on ignorance and ideology, and it cost Germany the war. But even with America now fully committed to Europe, the Allies still had to actually get there. and in September 1944, one general's refusal to listen to his own intelligence officers would nearly throw away the chance to end the war a full year early. Section 9. Operation Market Garden, September 17th to 25th, 1944. By September 1944, the Allied breakout from Normandy had exceeded almost every expectation. After the D-Day landings in June, the Germans had held the Allied advance in the hedgerow country of Normandy for weeks. Then in late July, the Americans broke through at Saint-Lô, and everything accelerated. German forces across France collapsed and retreated at a pace that stunned even optimistic Allied planners. Paris was liberated on August 25th. Brussels fell on September 3rd. Antwerp on September 4th. The Wehrmacht was falling back so fast that many Allied commanders genuinely believed the war could be over by Christmas. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery believed he had the plan to finish it. Montgomery proposed a single, narrow thrust rather than the broad front advance Eisenhower favored. A massive airborne operation would drop tens of thousands of troops behind German lines in the Netherlands to seize a series of bridges over the major river crossings between Belgium and Germany. Then a British armored column, 30th Corps, would drive 64 miles north up a single road through the captured bridges and cross the Rhine at Arnhem, the last and most critical bridge. Once across the Rhine, the Allies would be inside Germany, the Ruhr industrial heartland would be outflanked, and the war's end would be within reach. Montgomery argued this could happen before winter. Eisenhower approved it. The operation was planned and launched in 7 days. The plan required 3 American and British airborne divisions to seize and hold a sequence of bridges. The U.S. 101st Airborne would secure bridges around Eindhoven in the south. The U.S. 82nd Airborne would take the bridges at Nijmegen in the middle. The British 1st Airborne Division, reinforced by the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade, would seize the Rhine Bridge at Arnhem in the north, the furthest objective, 64 miles behind the German front line. The problem that would destroy the operation was already known before the first parachute opened. Allied intelligence had been tracking the movement of German forces in the Netherlands. Ultra, the code-breaking program at Bletchley Park that decrypted German radio traffic, had identified that the 9th SS Panzer Division and the 10th SS Panzer Division, both part of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, had moved to the Arnhem area to rest and refit after heavy losses on the Eastern Front. Both divisions were under strength. The 9th SS had only 2 operational Panther tanks at the start of the battle, the 10th SS between 5 and 14 operational tanks. But they had experienced officers, trained soldiers, armored vehicles, and the organizational capacity to respond rapidly to an airborne landing. Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, was sufficiently concerned by the ultra-intelligence that he traveled to Montgomery's headquarters on September 15th, 2 days before the operation launched, to raise the issue directly. He suggested the landing zones for the British 1st Airborne should be shifted or the plan modified. Montgomery dismissed the concern and refused to alter anything. Inside the British Airborne Planning Staff, Major Brian Urquhart, the Chief Intelligence Officer for 1st Airborne Corps, no relation to the division commander, had obtained aerial reconnaissance photographs showing tanks in the Arnhem area. He had also received reports from the Dutch resistance confirming German armored units near the planned landing zones. Urquhart brought his concerns to Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, who commanded the airborne operation. Browning arranged for Urquhart to be examined by a medical officer and placed on medical leave for nervous exhaustion. His warnings were effectively silenced. Operation Market Garden launched on September 17, 1944, with one of the largest airborne operations in history. The drops were largely accurate. The 101st Airborne secured most of its objectives around Eindhoven. The 82nd Airborne took the bridge at Grave, and eventually, after fierce fighting, the bridge at Nijmegen. But the British 1st Airborne at Arnhem ran into the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. The landing zones for the British division were 8 miles from the Arnhem Bridge, a distance chosen partly because of concerns about anti-aircraft defenses near the bridge itself. Of the 4 battalions that set out for the bridge on the first day, only 1 got through. The 2nd Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost. Frost's roughly 740 men reached the north end of the Arnhem Road Bridge and occupied the surrounding buildings. They were supposed to hold for 2 days until Den 20 Corps arrived. They held for 4. The rest of the British 1st Airborne was stopped west of Arnhem by SS infantry and armored units that moved with a speed and coordination that the Allied planners had not anticipated from a supposedly broken enemy. Communications within the division collapsed. The radios assigned to the operation had frequencies that were largely useless in the wooded terrain around Arnhem. Commanders could not coordinate. Reinforcements arriving on the 2nd and 3rd days were fed into a battle that was already being lost. 30 Corps, advancing up the single road the entire operation depended on, was repeatedly delayed. The road ran along a raised causeway above flat, flooded Dutch farmland. Tanks could not move off it without sinking. German forces attacked the road repeatedly, cutting it in several places and forcing time-consuming fights to reopen it each time. The armored column that was supposed to reach Arnhem in 2 days never got there at all. On September 19th, German forces cut off Frost's battalion at the bridge. The men fought through the night and into the following days in the buildings around the north end, running out of ammunition, food, and medical supplies, with wounded men filling every room. On September 21st, the position was overrun. Frost himself was wounded and captured. On September 24th and 25th, approximately 2,100 survivors of the British 1st Airborne were ferried back across the Rhine under fire in small boats. Around 500 were either dead or taken prisoner. The crossing of the Rhine and the drive into Germany were delayed by 6 months. The war in Western Europe continued into the spring of 1945. Montgomery later admitted in his memoirs that the 2nd SS Panzer Corps was refitting in the Arnhem area, and that its battle state was far beyond Allied expectation. The intelligence had been there. The warnings had been made. They were not heeded. The failure at Arnhem meant the war in Europe lasted into May 1945, rather than ending in late 1944. But even as Market Garden was collapsing, a different kind of near miss was unfolding in laboratories and production plants, one that had nothing to do with armies or bridges, and everything to do with physics. Section 10. Germany's failure to build the atomic bomb, 1939 to 1945. Germany discovered nuclear fission first. On December 17, 1938, chemist Otto Hahn and his colleague Fritz Strassmann, working in a laboratory in Berlin, successfully split the uranium atom. The discovery was announced in January 1939. The implications were immediate and obvious to physicists across the world. If a chain reaction could be sustained, the energy released would be incomprehensibly large. A weapon built around that principle would be unlike anything that had ever existed. Germany had made the discovery. Germany had some of the finest physicists on Earth. Germany was 4 months away from launching the most destructive war in human history. The question of what Germany would do with nuclear fission next was, in the spring of 1939, one of the most frightening questions in science. The answer, it turned out, was not enough. In April 1939, Germany launched its nuclear weapons program, formerly known as the Uranverein, the Uranium Club. Werner Heisenberg, who had won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1932 for his work in quantum mechanics, became its intellectual leader. The program recruited serious scientific talent and had the formal backing of the German military. On paper, it looked formidable. The first critical mistake came early and quietly. To sustain a nuclear chain reaction, the fast neutrons released by splitting uranium atoms need to be slowed down. This requires a moderator, a substance that absorbs neutron energy without absorbing the neutrons themselves. 2 options were available: graphite and heavy water. Graphite was abundant, cheap, and producible at scale inside Germany. Heavy water was rare, required specialized industrial facilities to produce, and existed in meaningful quantities in only one place in the world, the Norsk hydro plant at Vemork in Norway. The German program chose heavy water. The reasons for this choice remain debated by historians. What is documented is the consequence. The entire German nuclear program became dependent on a single foreign facility that could be sabotaged, bombed, and destroyed, and eventually was. Graphite, which the Americans would use successfully in the world's first operational nuclear reactor under Enrico Fermi in Chicago in December 1942, was never seriously pursued by the German program. Heisenberg himself, in conversations recorded after the war, acknowledged that he had never considered graphite a viable option, a judgment that subsequent analysis has shown was based on a flawed calculation of graphite's neutron absorption properties. The program also lacked the one thing that turned scientific research into a weapon: priority. Hitler was far more interested in the V2 rocket program. When Heisenberg presented the nuclear project to an audience of scientists and government officials in 1942, the presentation failed to generate the political momentum needed to unlock the resources a serious weapons program required. The German Army Ordnance Office demanded in December 1941 that something of immediate military use emerge from the nuclear research within 9 months. When the physicists explained that was impossible, authority over the program was transferred to a civilian research council, effectively demoting the project in the hierarchy of German wartime priorities. It never recovered that standing. The organizational structure made it worse. Where the American Manhattan Project brought together the country's top scientific minds into a single, coordinated effort with unified leadership, shared resources, and direct government support at the presidential level, the German program remained fragmented. Multiple research groups worked in different cities with limited coordination, competing for scarce materials and rarely combining their results in ways that accelerated progress. Werner Heisenberg later complained that the Auer factory had been given an order for only half a ton of uranium, when it could just as well have been for 20 tons. The shortage of material, not the shortage of knowledge, was what killed the experiments, and nothing was done to fix it. Then came the sabotage. On the night of February 27, 1943, 9 Norwegian commandos who had been trained in Britain infiltrated the Vemork heavy water plant at Rjukan in German-occupied Norway. Their mission, Operation Gunnerside, was to destroy the facility's heavy water production section. They got inside without firing a shot, placed their explosives, and escaped. The operation destroyed 500 kilograms of heavy water and wrecked the production equipment. The Germans attempted to ship their remaining heavy water stock to Germany in February 1944, loading the barrels onto a ferry called the SF Hydro to cross Lake Tinge. Norwegian saboteurs sank the ferry. The heavy water went to the bottom of the lake. By 1944, the Allied ALSOS mission, a foreign intelligence program specifically tasked with assessing Germany's nuclear progress, had gathered enough evidence to reach a clear conclusion. Germany had not come close to building an atomic bomb. The program had never achieved a self-sustaining chain reaction, the basic prerequisite for any weapons development. It was years behind where the Manhattan Project had been in 1942. The moment that confirmed this beyond any doubt came on August 6, 1945, when the scientists interned at Farm Hall in England heard a BBC broadcast reporting that an atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. Heisenberg's first reaction, recorded in transcripts that were declassified in 1992, was that he did not believe it. He told his colleagues it must have been something else, a conventional bomb perhaps, or propaganda. He then stated that it would have taken factories as large as the United States to make that much uranium-235. The Farm Hall transcript showed that Heisenberg had never correctly calculated the critical mass required for a nuclear weapon. He had believed it would take tons of enriched uranium. The actual figure was far smaller. General Leslie Groves, who directed the Manhattan Project, summarized the Allied position throughout the war. Unless and until they had positive knowledge to the contrary, they had to assume that Germany's best scientists were working on an atomic program with the full support of their government and full access to German industry. That assumption drove the Manhattan Project forward at enormous speed and cost. Germany had discovered fission first. It had Heisenberg. It had the institutional framework. What it lacked was graphite instead of heavy water, a unified command structure, genuine governmental priority, and 9 Norwegian commandos who chose the wrong night to stay home. The war ended in May 1945 in Europe and September 1945 in the Pacific. What this list of 10 moments shows, taken together, is that it did not have to end that way at all. And the distance between the history we know and the history that almost happened was, in almost every case, remarkably small. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.